Since the Industrial Revolution began in the 19th century, the world has largely been built on the energy supplied by fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and gas have found their way up from the depths of the earth and into our everyday lives, fueling almost every aspect of the modern world. Adding a layer of complexity to our relationship with fossil fuels is how reliant we are on them, not only for their energy, but for the industries they support. Within the South African context alone, 2.5 million people are employed in mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, all of which rely heavily on these ancient fuels for survival. But it has to change. With climate change now a firm reality and the realization that these finite resources will eventually run out, the world has begun focusing on how we can move to solutions that will not only improve the health of the planet, but also provide energy sources that are more sustainable. Welcome to The Current, an Investec Focus Radio podcast series on South Africa's energy transition. I'm Iman Rapetti, and over the course of the last 9 episodes, I've been joined by industry experts from within Investec and beyond to dissect and discuss how our country can move towards more equitable and sustainable energy solutions. With South Africa recently being recognized by the World Economic Forum as being among the top 5 countries that have achieved the highest levels of relative progress in their respective energy transitions, we also celebrate the successes the country has made. In this 10th and final episode, we revisit some of the series' highlights and reiterate the essential takeaways you need to know. So let's get started. In episode 1, we spoke to James Mackay, the CEO of the Energy Council of South Africa, as well as 2 Investec experts, Samantha Moy, Head of Sustainability, and Chris Holdsworth, Chief Investment Strategist. We started our conversation with an overview of the South African energy crisis and the need to move to renewables, with Chris highlighting the economic cost the country will pay if we do not transition.
It's a fairly complex situation that we face at the moment, where we are A, short of electricity, but B, we're producing the wrong kind of electricity. And that does pose some risk longer term to the competitiveness of our exports and, broadly speaking, the economy at large. We've already agreed to go down this path, the just energy transition. And we've taken money from some of our international partners to do that. So if we were to switch around and say it's too difficult, then we're going to renege on those international agreements. A vast array of fund managers across the globe are signatories to what is known as the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And these are companies that are obliged to encourage corporates to either emit less, or in the case of governments, to ensure that there are fewer emissions across the economy. And if we say we're just going to keep our coal stations going, we again will be cutting off access to favorable financing from those institutions, both for our companies listed in South Africa and secondly for the government as well. If we look at places like Europe, they're imposing tariffs to countries that don't have their own internal carbon pricing mechanism. And if, again, we don't charge for it locally, that means that our exports would be attracting tariffs for Europe and we'd be less competitive.
The other factor driving the energy transition is, of course, climate change. While a cleaner planet is a vital consideration, for James, there is other value that's being unlocked.
The energy transition is very important to climate, but actually what is driving it is a technology disruption. So clean tech is cheaper, better, it's more innovation, it's highly digitized, and it's going to serve consumers better in the future.
So there are benefits for the environment and for consumers. But what about those who rely on the fossil fuel-based energy industry to earn their living, like the 100,000 people employed in coal mining? I asked Sam where those people fit into this transition.
The just energy transition cannot happen unless you're thinking about the people at the center of it. Because we're such a carbon-intensive economy, there's a lot of jobs attached to that carbon intensity. So how do we shift those jobs, the people in those jobs, into cleaner energy jobs, green jobs? That has to be part of the conversation right at the beginning.
In a South African context, one of the biggest challenges for the future of energy is the role that Eskom, the beleaguered state-owned enterprise, will play. In episode 2 of the series, we spoke to Rudy Dix, head of the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the President, along with Investec's Martin Meyer, who heads up the Energy and Infrastructure Finance team. I started with a simple question to Martin. What's at the heart of Eskom's woes?
You're sitting with a coal fleet that not only is it aged, but it also hasn't been maintained properly. And when you try to do scheduled maintenance together with emergency maintenance, you do run into issues. So you may see reliability coming back, but what you're also going to see is trips that you're not expecting because of the state of the fleet. And if we're just relying on the coal-fired fleet to get us through this, we're not going to get there.
Eskom's woes may have come into sharp focus over the last few years, but the need to move away from a state-run power utility based on fossil fuels isn't a recent realization. Since 2011, government's REAP program has sought to attract private investment into renewable energy generation, and some significant updates to the program are garnering results in tandem with private sector investment.
Government has said, let's actually not have a limit on how much you can generate for yourself. So you can build, we will accommodate that. With REAP 5, REAP 6, now REAP 7 being bid, we had battery energy storage round. They're talking hundreds of billions in terms of how much needs to be invested in these programs, which is positive. We're seeing a lot of international investors who are keen to position themselves for these programs.
One of the boldest moves by government to resolve the electricity crisis is the unbundling of Eskom into 3 separate entities handling generation, transmission and distribution. Rudy explains how that decision extends beyond just delivering a more robust grid.
The first element of unbundling is taking transmission out of Eskom and creating it as a subsidiary, and it's going to give the National Transmission Company of South Africa quite important powers. One of the more fundamental powers is giving it the power to purchase on an open competitive market. So when you look at it from a market point of view, as more generators come on and the electricity has to be competitive from a pricing point of view, you're going to have to bring down the price. And we've seen that from a whole set of studies. Globally, it shows us the electricity pricing comes down when you set up in that way.
Having the right legislative framework and the right technology in place is only part of the solution. Ultimately, Eskom will have to ensure the right people are in place to make sure the utility operates as it should.
We have a highly motivated engineering team at many of the power stations. But you can be a trained engineer like in any other discipline, but it's the experience that counts, right? The business colleagues together with Eskom are supporting the deployment of a number of people that have left Eskom or have the experience as engineers or understood how to run power stations and redeploying them back into the 6 key power stations where we could get the most number of reliable megawatts from. And that process is underway.
This approach, along with other interventions, seems to be paying off, as by the end of June 2024, South Africa had experienced 100 days of no load shedding after a particularly grueling run of the planned outages. But the future of South Africa's energy industry is not just about a more efficient power utility and public-private partnerships. It's part of a global push to phase out fossil fuels and is underscored by the agreement made by participating nations at COP28 in 2023. Melanie Janse van Vieren, Investec's global sustainability lead, outlines the establishment of the agreement.
There was a first draft saying it's a deliberate and complete cessation and elimination of fossil fuels. Obviously, most of the oil producing countries were not happy with that. Then they agreed, let's do a phase down of fossil fuel, a structural reduction towards zero. They don't specify how much and by when. There's no target set for the date to reach net zero. But then they also put in this just and equitable transition in the script. Basically, as different countries and communities have different needs and dependencies on these fossil fuels, you need to look at the workers in these communities, their livelihoods. The equitable side, on the other hand, says the burden and the benefits needs to be distributed fairly across countries and communities. In the past, the developed countries was the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, so they should take greater responsibility and provide support to the developing countries in this transition.
Regardless of the role that each nation might individually play within the parameters of the agreement, a shift away from renewables is understandably complex, And not just because coal, oil, and natural gas are cornerstones to critical industries like transportation and electricity generation. Their influence runs far deeper than many people might realize, making the job of phasing them out even more of a conundrum. Campbell Parry, Global Resource Analyst at Investec Wealth and Investment, elaborates.
We use fossil fuels to produce the clothes we wear, the detergents we use, the shaving creams, the lubricants and fuels, the inks and the paints, the plastics, preservatives, pharmaceuticals, cleaning agents. These are just some of these everyday items. People don't appreciate the link between fossil fuels and food. Firstly, 80% of the world's sulfur is produced by refining crude oil. That sulfur is used to produce sulfuric acid, and one of the things that it gets used for is to produce phosphate fertilizer for our crops. The second thing is natural gas. Hydrogen in methane is reacted with nitrogen from the air in the process to produce ammonia, the precursor for all nitrogen-based fertilizers.
One of the biggest moving parts in South Africa's just energy transition will be the mining sector's contribution to decarbonisation, not only in terms of the power they consume, but how their input will contribute to the shift and how the people within the sector are included. The energy-intensive users group, whose members include Anglo American, Sasol, South 32 and Sibanye, among others, is focusing on the energy trilemma. The body's CEO, Fanele Mondi, explains.
In terms of affordability, most of our members built their facilities on the premise that we had the cheapest electricity in the world at the time. So if we get out of that space where we become the most expensive, that is going to be a huge challenge.
A potential growth area directly related to decarbonisation is in platinum group metals, or PGMs. This group comprises several minerals, of which South Africa is a leading producer of two, namely platinum and palladium. PGMs may not necessarily be cleaner to extract, but their applications will create an impact in reducing harmful emissions. I asked Quentin Allison, head of Investec's commodity structuring and trading business, how PGMs fit into the picture.
They're used in catalytic converters for engines. That's the predominant use of PGMs today. And in a combustion engine, you typically have carbon monoxide as a direct result of the combustion process. Having a PGM catalyst in there can actually switch the carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide, which is more environmentally friendly. And having PGMs actually makes combustion engines more fuel efficient. Carbon capture is a big theme now in PGMs. We've got a good example of fertilizer producer in South Africa. Effectively, in the fertilizer production process, they emit nitric oxide into the atmosphere. And they've actually added a catalyst in that industrial process. That catalyst recaptures the nitric oxide before it goes into the atmosphere and makes the whole process cleaner.
Fossil fuels will be giving way to a host of renewable energies, some of which, like solar and wind, are a familiar part of our awareness of sustainable technologies. But there are other players, all promising to power the planet towards net zero. One of those players is battery technology, an essential component in creating baseload power tied to renewables. Here's Campbell again.
The holy grail is to make solar and wind non-intermittent, non-baseload form of energy. And the way to do that is to develop the right type of battery technology. And while the technology is improving steadily, there are still some limitations. And I guess the primary limitation is just it needs a lot of land, and you need a huge amount of capacity for just a few minutes of energy supply.
One of the more controversial elements of a future energy mix is nuclear. It spans an interesting divide in that while it's by no means a new source of power, it's one that is still undergoing development. And of course, it has strong opinions both for and against it. Campbell is an unabashed champion of nuclear. He explains why.
Nuclear as an energy source provides clean, carbon-free, baseload power 24/7 for decades and longer, and it has very high levels of efficiencies. It's a highly regulated industry globally. Safety issues are quite overblown. We know the technology. Some of the new utility-scale reactors that they're designing these days are much more efficient, much easier to run, and are very impressive.
Harold Hutchinson, Managing Director of the Alternative Energy Business at Investec UK, also sees a future in nuclear.
One of the debates within the nuclear industry at the moment is, well, perhaps some of these very large-scale power plants, such that we're considering effectively replacing the old sites in the UK. Perhaps actually what we should be doing is thinking much more locally and having these smaller nuclear reactors. And we have some great companies such as Rolls-Royce that would be involved for that.
Another renewable that gets a lot of press is hydrogen, although throughout the series it was clear that there are still some hurdles to overcome before it's a firm fixture on our grids. I asked Ian Ghosh, Investec's head for cross-asset investment strategy, for his opinion.
I think there are a few challenges as we speak. So firstly, transporting green hydrogen from Africa is still a conundrum. The other way to develop or to become an exporter is, can we develop a pipeline between Africa and Europe or to different parts of the world? But the question here is, we need a lot of financial muscle and a lot of investment for such infrastructure to play out. For example, if you look into the Africa Green Hydrogen Alliance, which is an initiative launched at COP26, I think the alliance member countries, including Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, Namibia, South Africa, would require a huge investment of $450 billion to $900 billion of investment by 2050. So all I'm trying to argue is, I think it's still early days, and I think without adequate government support and without adequate funding, this looks like a challenge for now.
For Campbell, the case for hydrogen simply doesn't make sense at this point in time.
It's not so much the constraining factors to producing, it's whether it makes sense or not. And we always think that energy transition can only happen, and in the past have only happened when the thing replacing the older form of energy is cheaper and more efficient. And that's just not the case yet with hydrogen.
The current podcast series review continues after this.
Considering the current energy crisis and infrastructure challenges in South Africa, Investec aims to provide a tailored and innovative offering to support clients in finding and funding sustainable solutions in solar. If you're looking for a turnkey solar solution for your home, apartment, rental property, or maybe you need a renewable energy solve for your business, Investec can provide bespoke finance up to 100% for you or your business. Find out more by clicking on the link in the podcast notes or search Investec Sustainable Solutions.
When it comes to renewable energy technologies, the one that resonates most with South Africans is most certainly solar. Its adoption by consumers has been driven largely as a load-shedding countermeasure, and according to the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association, or SAPVIA, there are now 126,000 households generating 5.4 gigawatts of clean power. I asked SAPVIA's technical specialist, Davet Talyard, how we stack up globally.
From a global perspective, I'm happy to report that we are on the scoreboard, at least. So from a projected installed capacity point of view in 2024, we projected to be number 10 at around 4.3 gigawatts projected for the year. That's by Bloomberg New Energy Fund. At the end of last year, SAPVIA assisted the BNEF team with their projections for 2024. And if you look at that scoreboard, number 3 is India at approximately 18 gigawatts projected for 24. United States is 40 gigawatts. And then far ahead, number 1 is China at 313 gigawatts. So at least we're on the scoreboard, but there's still a while to go.
If 86% of all solar installations in South Africa are residential, what's happening in the large-scale commercial and industrial space? Bernard Geldenhuys, a senior transactor within Investec's Energy and Infrastructure Finance team, gave us an overview.
We're seeing a lot of growth. We now have about 3.5 gigawatts of renewable energy projects that have been contracted, with about 120 megawatts in operation, 2,200 megawatts in construction, and another 1,200 progressing to financial close. The risk mitigation independent power producer procurement program also came to an end recently. About 600 megawatts of firm green capacity will come online in the next 24 months. In terms of overall investment in the REIPP program up to December 2022, it attracted about 220 billion rand of total investment, of which 42.6 billion was foreign direct investment, and that's across about 10 gigawatts of renewable energy.
Clearly, things are picking up in the corporate and industrial sector. Commercially, renewables must be starting to make sense then.
payback periods are getting shorter. Firstly, the Eskom tariff increases have been excessive over the last couple of years, and we expect to increase by a further 12% for the year 25-26. The second reason is a reduction in the cost of PV modules and battery energy storage systems due to some oversupply in the market, not just South Africa, but also globally. And the third reason is tax incentives. So the first incentive that jumps to mind is Section 12BA, that allows you 125% deduction until 28 February 2025.
One thing that's particularly important, especially within the South African context, is the concept of equity and equitable access for everyone else. I asked Yvette if there were any schemes that provided renewable energy to underserved communities.
One example that is quite popular in other countries is this concept of community solar, where you take advantage of economies of scale and install large-scale solar PV and battery energy storage systems at a single feeder point that feeds an entire community. And what that would allow the community is to have access to clean, low-cost energy. Unfortunately, the ownership models and the funding models haven't been completely unpacked in South Africa yet. But that is something that we at Sapphire see as a solution to lower income communities benefiting from solar PV.
If you've invested in rooftop solar at your home, you're probably wondering how soon it will be before you can start making money from feeding the excess electricity back into the grid. And what does this mean for municipalities who make the majority of their revenue from the provision of electricity? Devet weighs in.
There are currently 46 municipalities in the country that allow backfeeding of electricity into their network that have some form of remuneration. So there are municipalities that are seriously looking at embedded generation and solar PV as an opportunity and not necessarily as a danger to their municipal revenue streams. But the cost of the meter is prohibitive at the moment. Luckily, the City of Cape Town came out with a significantly cheaper single-phase meter to allow energy to be fed back into the network. But on top of that, I think it's about having a feed-in tariff that is high enough to incentivize registration, but not to negatively impact the revenue model of the municipality is really important.
In episode 7 of The Current, we had a fascinating discussion on the explosion of the electric vehicle market globally. And we looked at why South Africa is in the slow lane when it comes to EVs, with just under 1,000 electric vehicles sold in 2023. Mel Humphreys, Head of Sustainable Solutions at Investec Private Bank, explains why we're lagging behind.
At the moment, the import tax on electric vehicles is 25% against internal combustion engine vehicles. That is at 18%. And then in addition to that, for vehicles over 700,000, there's an additional ad valorem tax of 17% and above.
Mark Rain, co-CEO of Mercedes-Benz South Africa, agrees.
Electric vehicles in South Africa are too expensive. And I always lobby for the fact that we need price parity of internal combustion engines and electric vehicles. I'm not even talking about subsidies. I'm just saying don't put electric vehicles at a disadvantage. I could import a V12 super sports car at lesser import duties than an electric vehicle. That needs to be matched on the same level. That would put electric vehicles at a great advantage because you can't look at the vehicle purchase price. You need to look at what we would call the cost of ownership. Looking at the average fuel consumption, average driver of Mercedes-Benz probably spends 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 rand per month on fuel. If you take an electric vehicle, that goes down by 2/3, at least at the highest rate which you would be charging your vehicle. But it could go even lower if you're fully off the grid.
Despite the high costs and other challenges like range anxiety and the perceived lack of EV charging stations, Investec is seeing how some clients are quite literally buying into electric mobility.
Investec's private banking clients are often early adopters in terms of new technology and innovation. We have over 200 new energy vehicles within our book. So that includes electric vehicles, hybrid plug-in vehicles, and that comprises around 1.5% of the total new energy vehicle fleet in South Africa. In a recent survey, over 30% of our clients said they would actually consider buying an electric vehicle.
Mark is also bullish on the future of EVs in South Africa.
South Africa was late to the party, but I still feel that the South African market is predestined to become an electric vehicle market. No other country is as ready to do the energy transition as South Africa is.
The EV ecosystem is also growing in the country, with innovative startups like Everlectric making EVs more accessible for businesses that own fleets, like Woolworths and Aramex. Company co-founder and CEO Ndia Magadegela unpacks two key considerations for the organization's clients.
For players that are doing high number of kilometers, over 3,000 kilometers, it is cheaper to lease an electric vehicle than to lease an internal combustion engine vehicle. There are two pain points that market has. One, it is the cost of fuel. The running costs of an electric vehicle are way less, even though the initial purchase price might be higher. An electric vehicle is 10% to 20% cheaper if you look at the all-in cost. And then two, it is the ESG commitments. People are actually concerned about their carbon footprint, and therefore, even though they are finding that the cost of buying the electric vehicle is quite high, on the leasing model, it actually works.
2 episodes of The Current focus specifically on finance and investment. The economic benefits of decarbonization can be overshadowed by the climate discussion, but for Anna Heidecker, CEO of Africa Green Co., economics provide the stronger motivation for the shift to clean energy.
The mitigation of climate change would not be enough to make it economically appetizing as it is at the moment. The reason why it's becoming so prominent is because it's cheaper to deliver and quicker. The private sector is also taking the lead on it. And most importantly, the private sector that is taking the lead on it in South Africa are those companies that are mainly industrial and commercial companies that need to comply with global export and other criteria to make their commodities more competitive on an international market, which currently requires significant proof of compliance with decarbonization targets. So if you look at all of that through an ecosystem lens, then what we are witnessing today is a complete convergence of economic interests between energy decarbonization targets of the critical minerals industries with the GDP growth of most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa, and add to that the global climate targets that we are all trying to achieve. Africa's role in the overall global energy transition cannot be overstated. Global energy transition can bring sufficient benefits to the continent because the continent holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves that are required for decarbonization to take place in the first place. So the renewable energy element is just the one piece of this wider, beautiful convergence that we see is taking place at the moment.
I asked Siad Sarang, CIO of Revigo Fund Managers, just what's standing in the way of the continent taking advantage of such a large opportunity.
You need certain characteristics for attracting investment. You need a legislative framework to allow the building of power stations, etc. You need property rights to own assets. Those are just the core building blocks of an enabling environment. You need good regulation, you need attractive financial markets, and if you have those ingredients in place, you're able to attract financing, entrepreneurs, and risk takers. That means you have people coming together with capital to provide services.
Is there an opportunity for the continent to leapfrog to green industrialization?
Absolutely. I like to use the example of the parallel market that developed in mobile phones. And if you look at how mobile phones developed in Africa, it leapfrogged all of the cable technology in the telecoms industry. I see this parallel for renewable energy. We benefit from the latest technology at the cheapest price. If you look at solar panel prices over the last decade, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, panel prices fell by 82%. So you can repower the grid at a much cheaper rate now than you did 10 years ago. That allows you to put on power very quickly, and from that perspective, do lots of projects at scale, which is absolutely needed.
For Anna, overcoming the infrastructure investment challenges will see South Africa reaping tremendous reward, given its positioning within the region.
South Africa sits within the context of this incredibly fast-growing and evolving regional energy market environment. And I stress that word regional. It's a market environment that has reached a convergence of economic interests between what is required globally on the decarbonization side and what is required locally when it comes to achieving decarbonization targets. We believe the Southern African power pool market, its growth and future integration with East African power pool, provides a unique opportunity for South Africa to leverage its access to the regional market for attracting more domestic investment.